Good day. Today is the topic is authoritarianism here, there, and everywhere. But before I talk about that, Dean Goodder reminds me today is the 58th anniversary of the assassination of Jack Kennedy. And seems a long time ago, right? Different world we lived in at the time. And as most of us probably remember, exactly where we were today, this time, 58 years ago. Anyhow, let us get to today's topic. There are lots of words, lots of concepts, which I encourage you to Google so I don't spend all my time defining things. But, politically, there are different systems in their pure form. They have definitions. There is democracy, there is autocracy, there is authoritarianism, there is communism, and then there are economic systems, for example, capitalism, and for example, socialism. Now, all of these things mean different things, and different societies have had, at various times, democracy as defined when you look it up. And various countries have had communism, communism as in derivative of Karl Marx, but as practiced by the Soviet Union, imposed on East Europe, Cuba, for all practical purposes, China. And there are authoritarian governments, which means the government more or less controls most things, often the political realm, but sometimes and very often also the economic realm. It's purely defined. An autocrat is an individual. He may be heading a government that's also authoritarian and sometimes not yet or used to be or not ever. And these terms are thrown around, and I would like to propose to you that in 2021, these are somewhat intermixed. So let me give you a really bad and simple-minded analogy. Imagine a plate of food. You've got potatoes, you've got a carrot or two, you might have another green vegetable, and you might have a piece of meat. Imagine each of these items on your plate representing a different one of these terms, democracy, authoritarianism, autocracy, and so forth. And now also imagine, to make the whole thing taste better, a little bit of sauce is put on top of it, which means that the items you can still taste the carrots, they're still carrots, but they now have some additive to it, which makes them slightly different. But now imagine that you take this whole plate of food and you dump it in a big pot to make a stew, and you add some chicken broth or some other kind of broth and some seasoning. Now, at this particular point, the items all get sort of mixed up. You might be able to still identify a carrot or a potato, but now you have an intermixture of these items superimposed through the broth and the new seasoning. And none of the items either taste or necessarily even look like they were before. And I would like to propose to you that in 2021, almost all societies have both mixed and off political systems, and often mixed political and economic systems. Why this is so, we can talk about and speculate. But for example, you have a democratic society. What does that mean? For let's say 21 out of the 50 African countries, it means you hold elections, but you don't actually have the content of democracy. The content of the society may be an autocrat who's running things, it may be some socialism, it may be a military dictatorship, it may be all kinds of things, but you still have elections. And it is not atypical of the contemporary period to have the format of democracy, democracy as defined in the definition you find online, and at the same time, you don't no longer have the content. That is that yes, leaders get changed through elections, but are the elections fair? Are the elections even competitive? And even if they are competitive, whoever wins, are they in fact running a democratic society, or did they simply get to their particular position through the format of democracy? You have similar things in terms of economic and social and political formats. For example, you have a Marxist socialist government in, let's say, communist, even though one can argue about that, China right now. But the communism assumed joint ownership, right, of the society, of the economy, and the well-being. And in point of fact, what has made China affluent in the last decade or two has been capitalism. Industry and everything, once upon a time, agriculture used to be state-owned. It's mostly not state-owned anymore. Yes, there's still some state-owned elements, but not really. You have Russia, right? Russia has an autocrat. You can argue it's also an authoritarian government, given how they're running things. But you also have oligarchs who make their money through normal capitalist activity. You have on the other side very democratic, meeting many of the criteria of democracy, let's say Scandinavian countries, let's take Sweden, for example. And at the same time, you have the economy operate through capitalistic enterprise, but the taxation goes to the government, right, as it does in many societies. And the tax money is spent in ways that support various services to society. Especially from the American conservative and right wing, this spells socialism, and it's somehow against democracy. But in point of fact, they're very democratic, pluralistic societies, right? People make the choice that they want the government to perform certain services for them. All societies do that, even the most democratic societies. Think the United States for a minute. On the one hand, we have competitive, or mostly up until now, competitive elections. And these elections produce governments. The government taxes society and both businesses and individuals. And the tax money is spent for various government services. Now, over time, these government services have come to include Social Security, more recently, health insurance. And what do people who oppose the government producing services, for example, in the recent debates, should there be early childhood education? Should there be services to clean up water nationwide? In other words, there is a debate going on in the United States of the Biden bills producing new services for society, which 20, 30 years ago were not produced. And under those people who believe that the government should not provide these services. They're against early childhood education and childhood care and family leaves and those things, which, by the way, all Scandinavian countries have and most of the European democracies have. But anyway, up until now, we have not had most of these. And they say this is bringing socialism. And by socialism, they don't mostly even mean an economic system of redistribution. They mean socialism is attached to authoritarianism of one kind or another. It is changing democracy in some fundamental way. So you're beginning to have a kind of mix-max in the ideologies of people and in their belief system as to how the political system fits together with the economic system, and if you have what the obligations of the political system meant to be. Now, from the perspective, let's say, of the United States, for a long time, the idea was once you had taxation, which, by the way, you didn't have in the early days of the United States, once you had taxation, that would support certain things like the military, after Second World War, building a highway system, right? But now people are saying it's going too far. They're going to provide services that we really don't believe in. But they make it sound not so much as economic choices, but economic choices attached to non-liberal democratic political systems. So I could give you many illustrations, but what I'm suggesting right now is that in many parts of the world, you now have democratic elections, but the society is not run in a democratic fashion. They are run in an authoritarian fashion, or an autocrat is running it. And you have some societies that are very democratic, many of the European, Central and Northern European countries that are run very democratically, but also have a different conception of the role of government, which, if you are critical of government providing more services for its citizens, and if you're American, you say this is socialism and we don't want socialism. We don't want a government to interfere in the personal affairs and the liberties in our country. In other countries, a whole bunch of Latin American countries, Nicaragua, Venezuela, El Salvador, more or less most Central American countries other than Costa Rica, what you have is fairly democratic elections most of the time, but you have authoritarian governments sitting underneath these democratic elections. And the economies tend to be mixed economies, mixed as in capitalism and mixed as in taxation systems in which government provides services, which, if you're critical of them in particular, you refer to as socialism. Socialism used to not be thought of as a curse word, but in many corners of the United States, it's considered nowadays a curse word. Now, has any of this changed? And my assertion is that it has changed, and it has changed very much in the 21st century. First, to just repeat what I said, most governments, most societies are now mixed societies, but also mixed both politically and economically. But also it has changed because one used to think of states as having sort of hard borders, mostly hard borders. Then we got used to the idea that there was globalism, exchanges of economy, politics, human beings, and so forth. And now it increasingly appears and can be documented that it's not just that countries are interwoven from the perspective of their economies and let's just leave it there, in the economies and some other things, but rather that technology has created a situation where countries interfere in each other's affairs, not just by warfare and taking them over, but by being able to get inside the societies, culturally, politically, in every imaginable way, so that countries themselves are no longer particularly in control of their domestic situations. Much of this, as we read in the newspaper, has to do with contemporary technology, right? Contemporary technologies allowing first people to be able to see what's happened in other societies through satellites that spy and so forth, but also that the technology nowadays allows technology companies to sell technology to countries, to governments, to individuals, to political parties, which allow them to interfere in the economies, but also in the politics of other countries. We've had much of the discussion to what extent, for example, Russia interfered in our elections, right? But it's also the case that Russia, lots of countries interfere not only internationally in other societies, but are able to interfere in the lives of their own citizens whose views of themselves, their own society, and the world can be manipulated. Now, let me give you one of the starkest example of all of this. Israel, as it turns out to me, is a highly technological society, and it has a company, the initials are NSO, which has developed technology which is bandied about as Pegasus, which allows essentially people to invade people's cell phones without them knowing it, worldwide, everywhere, so that a government can know what its oppositions is, and external forces who monitor this can also find out what's what in different organizations, how to intervene, how to pay individuals, how to infiltrate. So nowadays, what your preferred system might be is intervened through the technology worldwide, so that your ability to control the economics of the globalization of the economy has been reduced over some time. We can see this now in terms of the post-COVID mess of not getting goods and so forth. But it can also intervene in the politics. So, for example, let us say there is an autocrat in country X. That autocrat might want to have better control of his own society, to know who the opposition is, what they're doing, and so forth. He buys or has donated this technology, which allows him to monitor, or her, but mostly him these days, which allows him to monitor all the citizens in the country that the government wants to monitor. Very easily through their cell phones. They don't even know that that's happening. Okay, which means, of course, that the government has the ability to control not only its own population, but the relationship of its own population to external actors who may be supporting them. So, what kind of countries are availing themselves of this? Many, many countries. Almost all North African countries, Morocco, for example, almost all the Gulf state countries. One of the reasons the Gulf countries are playing ball with Israel is because Israel has helped them technologically do all of this stuff, right? But our governments, for example, governments buying them who we don't suspect. I mean, nominally more democratic governments. Well, this technology is bought, for example, by Mexico, right? So you think, well, Mexico is a neighbor, a democratic state. What are they doing asking Israel to, or having purchases from this company in Israel to allow them to monitor? Well, in Mexico nowadays, you have what, for all practical purposes, an autocrat. The society is still democratic, It is not as yet an authoritarian state, but the autocrat is trying to control things here, there, and yonder, right? And the technology allows him to do that. So, on the one hand, you have autocrats, for example, in Europe, let's take Eastern Europe, right? They suffered under communism. Now you have Orban in Hungary, who's an autocrat. Is the society authoritarian yet? Reasonable people can argue about that. But he's certainly an autocrat trying to control all things. They're going to have an election soon. To what extent will external factors contribute to the outcome of that election? You take Poland, on the other hand, right? Poland still has elections. Nominally a democratic society, after communism became much more of a capitalist society, but you have an autocratic government which is trying to control all kinds of things in the society. And the question is, insofar as, for example, it is violating the rules of the European Union, replacing judges which are not judging in the way that the government wishes them to judge. So here is Poland, a member of the European Union, violating the rules of the European Union. What can the European Union do about it? But in the meantime, if we as outsiders look at it and say, well, actually, does it look like Poland is sliding into authoritarianism? So, and next door you have Belarus. We've all been reading about the horrible refugee situation. Well, Belarus, of course, and Putin are aligned, but there he has control of the society. So in the case of Belarus, you can say it is both an autocrat running an authoritarian society, right? So what am I sketching here? A big mix-max, and something that has never been known in history before. You've had all kinds of alliances. You have had invasions. You've had mercenaries in one country operate in another country. But you have never had the technological capacity for actors to purchase technology, avail themselves of technology, or have the technology that they can get into the insides of government and government actors elsewhere, but also opposition groups, labor unions, what have you, corporations stealing, technological knowledge, but also individuals and citizens. So the interdependence and the globalization that we're talking about in the 21st century is fundamentally different than what one talked about in the 19th and 20th century, by and large, in terms of globalization. And of course, there was some spying, the US on Russia, Russia on the US, and so forth. But even governments are not able to control these things anymore. So the out of control nature, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the capacity of governments, democratic governments, non-democratic governments, authoritarian governments, autocrats, governments in disarray, individual groups, all availing themselves, if they have the funds and the technological know-how, to creep into the crevices of political systems and economic systems. And so then the question is, how do governments wrestle back control if they want to? On the one hand, authoritarian governments or communist governments, and control them. Well, some governments have an easier time, if they are authoritarian, to try to control things. Democratic societies tended to be more open and are, either surprised or have a hard time, as the U.S. has had in the last election or two. But then the question is, governments then need resources and power and strengthening. And here we have an interesting dilemma as the United States, which is many of our fellow citizens and politicians believe that American democracy and federalism works best with small d, small democracy and less government. So let's look at that for a couple of minutes. Less government means, okay, we have accepted highways, we have accepted Social Security, we accepted some of those things. But now many amongst us don't want to accept the additional government activities have to support social life, health, and so forth in the United States. And calling those things socialism and unwarranted and so forth. That is certainly a point of view, and one can spend a long time arguing about this. But let me make a slightly different case about it. Let's suppose even those of us who are, let's say, liberal or progressive and believe government has a role and has a role in sustaining the quality of life of our citizens. There is now in the 21st century a new dynamic, and we really haven't thought that one through. There are two things happening. One is climate change, and the other is the aging of the population. And those are worldwide problems. But before we talk about international policies, one has to even ask questions about home. There is no way that climate change can be addressed and the aging of the population can be addressed without reconfiguring what the role of government should be. It could be, in the case of the United States federal government, it could be local government, but governments will have new issues on their agenda. Not totally new, of course, but the magnitude of them in the 20th century is growing. So the problem then becomes, how much should we tax ourselves and how much should we hand over, because we come to believe that climate change really is a major issue and needs to be addressed in this century very quickly. And furthermore, the aging population needs to be addressed because the services that are necessary to sustain people in their old age raise entirely new social problems, as does the fact that you need workers, and therefore you might need workers from outside the society, especially in countries, most Western countries, most industrial countries, where the birth rate is so low. And furthermore, it raises the question that there are many countries, poor countries in general, who are not in a position to address these issues, which also face them. And therefore, our collective tax money might have to drift out in quantities larger than we're used to in terms of aid in order to help the rest of the world stabilize the climate and do something about how you address aging populations, the movement of people, and so forth. So there's some very serious philosophic questions here, which are not just, sort of extreme right wing or people who believe that government should not do anything. And there, of course, even people who believe that our tax money should not go here, there, and yonder, and government should not do anything. It's interesting that even within that context, there's a lot of hypocrisy. For example, some of the very people who say, Second Amendment, we can all take assault rifles, 17-year-old can go some other state and kill people in a demonstration. That's okay because we're all entitled, to have guns and to shoot them. The very people who believe that, also are affected by the aging population and climate change, right? So their government should do something, and some other liberties are more important to sustain. Is it really the case that you need to move into authoritarianism to address these issues? I mean, after all, the state legislatures in places like Wisconsin and Michigan, who are saying if the outcome doesn't please us, we'll have a different political outcome, and who are now trying to pass legislation that professional poll people who monitor elections and poll watchers should be overridden by a legislature that can just determine that what the outcome should be, irrespective of the votes. And or that you should have the kind of gerrymandering that Texas and other states are having, which means that minority populations are gerrymandered out of being able to influence the outcome of an election. That all begins to smell like some form of authoritarianism. And so on the one hand, these folks say less government when it seems to be, addressing issues that either they think are unimportant or of no interest to them. And on the other hand, they then say, oh yes, government should not be interfering in, let's say, in guns. But let's say we're anti-abortion. Well, government should certainly stop anti-abortion, right? So the hypocrisy as you move from one issue to another, sometimes you want big government, sometimes you want small government. And the rationality between one and the other happens to be what your ideology is or what you happen to believe in. On the other hand, most people in democratic societies, including ours, are fearful that as you address the issues that are now global issues, and as the technology reduces your control inside your society, that a certain amount of authoritarianism is creeping in everywhere. And how to protect against that is a major assignment for us in the 21st century, who still believe that pluralism and democracy and so forth is a preferred political system. Because when you see that technology helps erode pluralism and democracy and freedom and those kinds of things, what kind of protections do you put in place if you're Sweden, or if you are Estonia, or for that matter, if the United States, to sustain as much as you can of the best parts of democracy, participation, and pluralism, and at the same time, don't stick your head into the sand and imagine that the technology that I mentioned earlier and the new issues that all societies and the globe has to address can leave things to the vagaries of each government, or you get a Trump, he does one thing, and you say to yourself, taking over an election and saying the outcome can be overridden. Does that look very democratic? Not, and it's scary. So what is happening in some democratic society is scary, whether it's in Hungary or whether it's in the United States, which is, I don't say we're hungry yet, but still we could become, raises serious philosophic questions, serious questions in terms of the role of the state, the nation state, serious questions about how you address the global issue, both internal to the society and your obligation internationally. And one point that I want to end on is the fact that one of the things you notice, and which is why I titled this talk Authoritarianism Here, There, and Everywhere, there are dangers leading towards more authoritarianism in all societies, whether they're already authoritarian or whether elements of them are beginning to look like authoritarianism. And of course, the authoritarianism is encouraged by the existing authoritarians, number one, and by the technology that is being developed by companies like the one I mentioned in Israel and some other places, which are, capitalists. They're making money, they're selling their goods, but their goods have serious implications for the future of the globe and for the future of not just our democracy, but other people's democracy. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again 2 weeks from now.